Okay, last week we talked about the fact that the Brush Run Church, when they began to immerse, they immersed the whole congregation. What few didn't want to be immersed left and went elsewhere. But after the immersion of the congregation took place, the Baptists began to look at them as those of like mind, and they began to ask Alexander Campbell to come and preach for them. From 60 miles around, Campbell traveled and preached to the various Baptist churches, but he never wanted to be identified with them as a Baptist. In Campbell's Millennial Harbinger that he wrote later on, here's what he had to say. He said, "I had no idea of uniting with the Baptists more than with the Moravians or the Independents. I had unfortunately," this is kind of funny I think, "I had unfortunately formed a very unfavorable opinion of the Baptist preachers as then introduced to my acquaintance, as narrow, contracted, illiberal, and uneducated men. This indeed, I am sorry to say, is still my opinion of the ministry of that association at that date, and whether they are yet much improved, I am without satisfactory evidence." Alexander had a problem of not being able to express himself with a full feeling. He wasn't intending to be a Baptist. I have got, well, I don't know if I gave him back or not, a couple of pamphlets written by a man whose goal in life is to tear down the Church of Christ. And he says that we were Baptists, that Alexander Campbell, rather, was a Baptist, and those who were associated with him were Baptists. Is that true? Were they Baptists? Campbell said, "I had no idea of uniting with the Baptists." Well, maybe he's a liar. Maybe he didn't know he felt like uniting with. I believe that he knew what he was talking about. He had no idea of being a Baptist. Let's not make him a Baptist by changing history to satisfy our needs today. Garland Elkins debated with this man. I can't think of his name now. It seemed like it's Hall, but I'm not sure. But he had a written debate with him, and that went into a book. And I found that very interesting to read Garland Elkins' side as well. Well, many of the Baptists, though, pressed Campbell to have the Brush Run Church, that little congregation that the Campbells established, join the Redstone Baptist Association. Now, why they wanted them is open to discussion, probably because they were immersionists. And because they were immersionists, they perhaps wanted the group to join them and give them some prestige. But they asked the Brush Run Church to join them. They had a meeting at the Brush Run Church. Should we or should we not join them? And the consensus was, let's go ahead as long as we are allowed to teach what the Scriptures teach, regardless of any creed or formula that they might have. On that basis, then, they were allowed to join the association. Now, ordinarily, a Baptist church had to agree to accept the Philadelphia Confession of Faith before they could become a part of a Baptist association like the Redstone. The Brush Run Church did not accept the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, but they were accepted into the association anyway. Shortly after the Brush Run Church was established, another church was established 8 miles away at Wellsburg. And this was close to a Baptist preacher by the name of Pritchard. Now you're going to hear me say Pritchard several times tonight. Pritchard became a thorn in the flesh of Alexander Campbell for many years. Perhaps it all started when they established this congregation near where he preached. The proposition of Brush Run joining the association was discussed at the next meeting of the Redstone Association. Guess who objected to them being taken in? Pritchard objected, of course, and he had some who agreed with him, but the minutes of the meeting of that day, September the 2nd, 1815, says that the Brush Run Church was accepted into the Redstone Association. Now you wonder, no doubt, why did they want to join this Baptist association? Whatever the reasoning was, this opened up vistas for Alexander Campbell that he could not have had otherwise. This opened windows of opportunity that would never have been opened otherwise. This was probably the worst mistake that the Baptist church could have made. As a direct result of that, I believe that thousands of Baptists left the Baptist church to join the Restoration. And it all goes back to the time when the Brush Run Church and Campbell were accepted into the Redstone Association. So, if it was a mistake more on the part of the Baptists than on the part of the Campbells. Now, let's pause to address the question again. Were the Campbells Baptists? Well, Campbell in his own words said, I had no idea of joining the Baptist church. But in addition to Campbell's own words, I came across something written by F.W. Maddox in his book, The Eternal Kingdom, in which he lists five ways in which they were not Baptists. Now, I think it's important for us to understand these. Sometimes today people will say, aren't you just about the same as the Baptists? No. Number one, the Baptists accepted the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, Brother Maddox says, as their bond of unity and the statute of discipline, and operated under it. Okay, now that would be our first variation. The Campbells rejected all creeds, including the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, as anti-Christian and a hindrance to unity on the basis of Bible alone. Number two, the Baptists stood for Calvinism, and Calvinism was their stock in trade. But Campbell said that Calvinism is a corruption of Christianity, it's a curse to the world, a cause of division, and a perversion of true faith. There we go again with Alexander having a hard time expressing what he really thinks. Number three, the Baptists generally took the Lord's Supper once every 3 months, sometimes once a month, but the Campbells maintained that the church had to break bread every Lord's Day, every week, and communion once a month was a departure from the original order. Number four difference. The Association Baptist Church believed that each congregation should have one bishop. Alexander and his group felt that if a congregation did not have a plurality of elders or bishops, that the congregation had digressed from the primitive purity. Number five, although it happened that the Baptists and the Campbells agreed on baptism, they actually didn't. That was only in appearance that they agreed on baptism. To the Baptist, immersion was an ordinance required for church membership. But to the Campbells, it was done in order to obtain remission of sins. A major, major difference. By the way, Campbell's position was not firm in that area until about 1823. But these basic differences indicate that Campbell never considered himself a Baptist. Well, on the next Redstone Baptist Association meeting at Cross Creek in 1816, more than 1,000 people were present. Campbell was only 28 years old at the time. He was just, in our minds, just a young man, a boy almost. But here he is going to the Redstone Baptist Association meeting, the first one that has occurred since they joined. Campbell wanted to preach to that group, but he told his wife before leaving, he said, I doubt that they will let me preach. There was a man there who was against him preaching. Guess what his name was? Pritchard, that same old fellow that was going to haunt Campbell for years to come. And he tried his best to block Campbell from preaching. He was not on the schedule. But a man who was on the schedule got sick, and they had to replace him with Alexander Campbell. Now he has the opportunity to preach to 1,000 Baptists. What is he going to preach on? Some have wondered, did he just speak extemporaneously? Did he come prepared? I think in his mind he knew exactly what he was going to preach on, and if he had the opportunity, he would preach it with all his heart. It was the Sermon on the Law. That may not sound terribly important to you, but this was a bombshell that was dropped into the camp of the Baptists. For some time, Campbell had been thinking about the relationship of the New Covenant to the Old Covenant. There was fuzzy thinking in the minds of the Baptists in those days. They were just as likely to go to the Old as to the New to tell a sinner what he must do. Campbell had come to the conclusion that much of the error in the religious world had the root source not understanding how to properly divide the word, mixing the new with the old. Campbell was no sooner underway with this sermon, preaching it with all of his heart, than Pritchard called out 2 or 3 of the Baptist preachers on the pretense that a woman had gotten sick and they needed to help her. But once he got out, Campbell found out later, what he tried to do was to convince those other preachers, we've got to stop him on the spot and expose him to the people because he is not preaching standard Baptist doctrine. One of the preachers that he called out says, Brother Pritchard, I don't know yet if he is or isn't preaching from the Bible, but I'll tell you this, if we stop him now, we will sacrifice ourselves far more than we will sacrifice Alexander Campbell. The people want to hear him. The Sermon on the Law is perhaps one of the most important things that Alexander Campbell did for the Restoration movement. In it, he showed that the law had been taken out of the way, Colossians 2:14. That's easy for us to understand. Most of us have heard sermons aplenty on that subject. But to these people, the thinking was not clear at all. The effect was tremendous on the Baptists. Immediately, a movement was started to charge Campbell with heresy for preaching non-Baptist doctrine. The next regular meeting of the Redstone Association was in 1817 at Peters Creek. And it was expected that surely he would be tried for heresy then, because all that year he had continued to preach such sermons. But here the subject of Campbell's heresy was brought up, but through the intervention of friends, it was dropped. Nevertheless, the feeling of the Baptist preachers toward Alexander Campbell was never cordial after that. Their attacking Alexander Campbell seemed to have fallen on deaf ears with the people, but not so with the leaders. They were against him. As far as the Baptist people were concerned, they wanted to hear him. Campbell believed that this Sermon on the Law was the springboard that he had needed to really put the Reformation or the Restoration in front of the people. Not just the Baptist people, but in front of all religious people. Like his father before him, Alexander was a natural-born teacher. And he wanted to prepare young men to preach the Word. So in 1818, he established what he called the Buffalo Seminary in his home. He even expanded I think he built around the porch so that he would have a place for the young boys to stay who were coming to the school, a dormitory. And though the school was well supported, Campbell closed it after 4 years because it was his idea to bring young men there to train them to preach the gospel. And during the time that they were there, he taught them science and he taught them language. But what they were doing was pointing the direction for their vocation in the law and in medicine, and few of them were interested in preaching. So after 4 years, he closed the school down. I don't know where we are on our outline. You just keep going down there and you'll probably find it. Okay, In the spring of 1820, Alexander Campbell was urged to engage in a public debate with a Presbyterian, a Seceder Presbyterian preacher by the name of John Walker. Now his first reaction is the same reaction that some people have today. Oh no, that isn't appropriate for me to debate. That isn't the way to defend the faith once for all delivered to the saints. But a Baptist preacher who felt very strongly about what Walker was doing in preaching about sprinkling infants. And he said, you must defend the teaching on baptism against this man. And so finally, he conceded. And the place of the debate was only 23 miles from Bethany in the town of Mount Pleasant, Ohio. Campbell was 32 years old at the time, and the debate was on the subject of baptism, specifically the mode of baptism. And this was to deal heavily with infant baptism. Walker was the first speaker, and his speech lasted all of 2 minutes. Now, here's a man who is brief indeed. He says he's going to speak 5 to 10 minutes, but it's only 2. Here's his whole speech. I'll give it to you. See what you think about the logic of his argument. Now, he's talking about infant baptism, really, which is just infant sprinkling. Actually, you don't sprinkle infants, do you? You sprinkle water on them. If you sprinkle the infants, it would not be good. Here's his speech. My friends, I don't intend to speak long at one time, perhaps not more than 5 or 10 minutes, and will therefore come to the point at once. I maintain that baptism comes in the room of circumcision, that the covenant on which the Jewish church was built, and to which circumcision is a seal, is the same with the covenant on which the Christian church is built, and to which baptism is the seal, that the Jews and the Christians are the same body politic, under the same lawgiver and husband. Hence, the Jews were called the congregation of the Lord, and the bridegroom of the church says, my love, my undefiled is one. Consequently, the infants of believers have the right to baptism. I believe I could debate a man that had that little of an argument. His argument is, he was saying that since infants could be circumcised in the Old Testament, then infants in the New Testament can be baptized. My, that's weak, isn't it? Campbell arose, and after introductory remarks said this. He said, I can't be persuaded. I can't persuade myself to believe that they who affirm that baptism comes in the room of circumcision really think so. For if they thought so, they would certainly act more consistently than they do. Here's a pretty sharp guide. There's 5 areas of inconsistency. If you say, okay, they circumcise infants in the old, therefore we baptize infants in the new. One is a seal of the old, one is a seal of the new. That's his argument. Campbell says, you are as inconsistent as you can be. Number 1, if you really believe that position, then they would baptize only males. Isn't that right? Number 2, they would baptize precisely on the 8th day of the child's life. Number 3, they would baptize all the slaves or the servants of the master of the household. After all, that's what occurred under the old, under circumcision. Number 4, they would not confine the administration of baptism to the clerical order, because both men and women circumcised their own children. And number 5, they would not confine baptism to the infants of professed believers only, for the most wicked Jew under the old law had the right to circumcise his children. Well, that was just one of the arguments, one of the days. In the last speech, Campbell issued a challenge, though. He said, I will debate. Now he's changed his mind. This is a wonderful way to defend the truth. He said, I'll debate any qualified person who teaches and practices infant baptism. That was his challenge, open challenge. The debate was soon put into book form, and it was distributed widely and favorably received, and a great deal of good was done by it. Campbell was then convinced that this was the way to go. He was not opposed to debating from then on. In the summer of 1821, Campbell was sitting on his front porch. He just finished his noon meal. He was kind of resting, waiting for the afternoon classes, and 2 men rode up on horseback, and he saw them out down by the path there. They tied up their horses and walked up to them. One of the men, they were both Baptist preachers, by the way, from Ohio. One of the men was Adamson Bentley. Have you ever heard of him? Adamson Bentley. Not many have. How about his brother-in-law, Sidney Rigdon? Ever hear of Sidney Rigdon? These men lived in Warren, Ohio. They were part of the Mahoning Baptist Association, but they had read the debate with this man, and they came to talk to Campbell about the things in that debate book. Well, Campbell had them wait until his afternoon teaching duties were over. They had supper together, and they began talking after supper. They talked all night long and until the next morning. They covered everything from the Old Testament to the New, Campbell doing the teaching and they doing the listening for the most part. But the next morning, Sidney Rigdon said, if I have within the past year taught 1 error, I have taught 1,000. Here he is, the orator of the Mahoning Baptist Association. And he said, I have taught 1,000 errors. Bentley and Rigdon left Bethany completely and thoroughly convinced concerning the principles that were advocated by Campbell. But Campbell cautioned them, don't begin to tear down anything that you've built until you've reviewed it again and again, and then do not act rashly. Be sure of what you're doing. These men were going back to the Mahoning Baptist Association with completely different ideas, ideas that would eventually bear much fruit for the restoration. Unfortunately, Sidney Rigdon in a few years would join with Joseph Smith. That's where you may have heard the name. And he, along with Joseph Smith, helped to create the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church. If we had more time, we could talk about the influence that he had on the formation of that. Johnny Ramsey gives Sidney Rigdon the credit, or the blame, actually, for writing the Book of Mormon. I think most scholars feel that the Book of Mormon was written based on a manuscript that a man named Spalding wrote. And what they did is they took that Spalding manuscript, which was never intended to be anything except a fictional religious book, and they expounded on that, added, threw in a lot of King James scripture, and formed the Book of Mormon. A man named Lewis Talbot, in his book, What's Wrong with Mormonism, he's not a member of the church, but in there he says, he's speaking of the Mormon leaders, he said there were the Pratts, Parley P. and Orson, and last but by no means least, there was Sidney Rigdon, to whom all serious students of Mormonism give full credit for the organization of the Mormon Church. But what a shame. Here we have this man who is at one point very dedicated to the truth, and he switched over. And you'll find several things that are similar in the teaching of the Mormon Church that were carried over, I fully believe, from the Church of Christ into the Mormon Church by Sidney Rigdon. Sidney did not always have a happy life. He had a confrontation with Joseph Smith when Joseph Smith wanted to take his daughter as one of his wives. It began to be a little bit more serious when Joseph was delving into his family for his wives. Well, we don't have time to talk about Sidney Rigdon other than he was a part of us and he left us. Now, the Mahoning Association would prove to be most helpful in the cause of promoting the restoration in years to come. We'll also later see that Campbell aligns himself with the Mahoning Association to escape action from the Redstone Association and Pritchard as the leader. Between 1827 and 1830, nearly all the Baptist churches within the Mahoning Association reformed, as they call it, left the Baptist church and became a part of the Restoration movement. But you have to go back to that meeting that Sidney Rigdon and Adamson Bentley had with Campbell. As they went back, they began to teach restoration principles that bore fruit. In the fall of 1822, Campbell began to think of giving up the Buffalo Seminary. He wasn't doing what he had hoped. Now he begins to turn his attention to a paper that he could develop and send out and do a great deal of teaching. And that paper became known as the Christian Baptist. The paper's name was going to be The Christian, but Walter Scott, great preacher, later on suggested to Campbell, rather than call it The Christian, in order to disarm prejudice, that's why he put it, let's call it the Christian Baptist. Well, the Christian Baptist was printed for 7 years, and you can buy the bound copies of all of its small print. Here we have the whole life of the Christian Baptist, the paper that Alexander Campbell wrote. In the spring of 1823, Campbell began to publish this. He bought the printing press, he bought the paper, he bought all the materials, and he began to print in a building right below the family cemetery. And here in the beginning of his papers, here's what he intended to do in the prospectus. He said, the Christian Baptist shall espouse the cause of no religious sect excepting the ancient sect called Christians, first at Antioch. Its sole object shall be the eviction of truth and the exposure of error in doctrine and practice. The editor, acknowledging no standard of religious faith or works other than the Old and New Testaments, and the latter as the only standard of the religion of Jesus Christ, will intentionally at least oppose nothing which it contains and recommend nothing which it does not enjoin. Having no worldly interest at stake from the adoption or reprobation of any article of faith or religious practice, having no gift or nor religious office of any worldly emolument to blind his eyes or to pervert his judgment, he hopes to manifest that he is the impartial advocate of truth. So there began the Christian Baptist. That paper did so much good that we can never totally weigh what good it did do. It went into thousands of homes to which he would never have gone. It went into hundreds of communities to which he would never have been invited. The Christian Baptist, in spite of the name that it could have been called differently, because it was called what it was, it found its way into many a Baptist home. And because of its name, perhaps, they began to read it and say, he's right, and we're wrong. We need to reform the church. We need to go back to the original. We need to reestablish the truth. We need to reestablish the church that we read about. So Campbell taught. He taught very strongly in the Christian Baptist. I like what one Baptist preacher said, and he wrote to him and he cautioned him. In fact, his name was Robert Cautious. In those days, they didn't use the real name. They had these neat little names, and they would write questions, and it would be published, and I guess nobody would be embarrassed. But Robert Cautious, Baptist preacher from Virginia, said this, and I think it's clever. He said, be careful that in leaving Babylon that you don't run past Jerusalem. If you think about that, pretty clever. If you think about it, you'll get it if you don't get it yet. In spite of his extreme positions, Campbell's paper exercised a great influence over a lot of people. It was met with a good reception by many and not a good reception by others. There were 2 or 3 occasions when the Baptists burned some of the works of Campbell openly. They didn't really like what it was doing, because what it was doing is pulling Baptists out of the Baptist church and heading them toward the Restoration. Creeds, confessions of faith, authoritative counsels of men were repudiated in the Christian Baptists as the editor launched out in his quest for truth. Some said, he's too harsh, he's bitter. But I'll tell you what, he had an acid tongue at times. But he wanted to expose error. He wanted to expose doctrinal falsehoods. He pleaded for a return to the church of the New Testament and for a destruction of denominationalism. Here is something that he wrote. Let me read it to you. He says, I have no idea of adding to the catalog of new sects. The game has been played too long. I labor to see sectarianism abolished and all Christians of every name united upon one foundation on which the apostolic church was founded. To bring Baptists and Paedo-Baptists to this is my supreme end, but to connect myself with any people who would require me to sacrifice one item of revealed truth, to subscribe to any creed of human device, or to restrain me from publishing my sentiments as discretion and conscience direct is now, and I hope ever shall be, the farthest from my desires and the most incompatible with my views. Campbell's goal was to restore New Testament Christianity. But you may wonder, how did he set about to do this? What were his intentions? How could you restore New Testament Christianity? He said it begins with dropping the writings, the doctrines of men that are accepted as authority. After that, then you go just by the Word. And that is the only way that the New Testament church can be established on earth. The people, he said, must abandon their language, custom, and manners of Ashdod. For this purpose, they will meet and read and examine the New Covenant writings. He said if they are correct, we'll accept them. If we are incorrect in what we're doing, then we'll throw out that practice that is not correct. We will allow the Word to decide if what we're doing is right or not, as we compare our practice with the Word. The Christian Baptist was read far and near. You may think it was just a little paper that went to various cities in the United States. But the Northern Whig of Belfast, Ireland, had this to say about the Christian Baptists. Don't you just think it's wonderful that that paper went into Europe and people were reading it, and it was doing great good over there. But here's what the editor said. He said, it might do good, provided it were written with less bitterness. I wonder if he agreed with Campbell. It is a mixture of pepper, salt, and vinegar, served with a dash of genuine Irish wit, with a great deal of instruction. Not that he agreed with him, but he had to respect what he wrote. It would be hard to estimate the great good that was done. Because of the name Christian Baptist, many Baptists were converted. Some of the great preachers of the Restoration movement have their conversion directly related back to the Christian Baptist. Raccoon John Smith first knew about this man, Alexander Campbell, and his teachings, at least to any degree, by reading the Christian Baptist. John T. Johnson, that was such a great preacher in Kentucky, was converted as a direct result of the teaching that he received from the Christian Baptist. Philip S. Fall, the great preacher of Nashville, Tennessee, owes his conversion to the Christian Baptist. Jacob Creeth Jr., the same. The parents of David Lipscomb were Baptists who were converted as a result of reading the Christian baptism. And on, no telling how many were converted as a direct result of reading that paper. Moses Lard, who was a great preacher of Kentucky, he said that the Christian Baptist is the masterpiece of Campbell's life. He said, in originality and utility, he's written nothing to excel it. So it was a great paper. It served its purpose for 7 years. Now, when the Christian Baptist made its effect on the Baptist church, the views of Alexander Campbell being made known were contrary to the Baptist doctrine. By 1823, opposition began to build toward him. His paper was there for every Baptist preacher to read. They knew exactly what he was teaching, and they began to oppose him with greater vigor. Elder Pritchard, there he is again, and his associates of Redstone simply were out to get him. They planned a public excommunication of Alexander Campbell when he came to the next meeting. There was not going to be any escape this time. Nobody was going to convince them to let him alone. They were going to publicly humiliate him. It was just days away. Campbell heard about it. He appeared before the Brush Run Church, and he asked for a letter of permission, he and 31 others, to leave the Brush Run Church and to move their membership over to the Wellsburg Church 8 miles away. This they granted, and immediately, thanks to Adamson Bentley, one of those two men that rode up to talk to Campbell, the Mahoning Association took the Wellsburg congregation into that association. Now, the next thing we see at that Redstone Baptist Association with Elder Pritchard with fire in his eyes, here comes Alexander Campbell to that meeting. And they've got him now. But he doesn't come as an official representative. They said, well, what are you doing here? I'm here as an observer, he said. No, you are a member of the Brush Run Church, and the Brush Run Church is a member of this association. He said, I'm not a member of the Brush Run Church. I'm not a member of the Redstone Baptist Association. I have nothing to do with it. He said, never did hunters, on seeing the game unexpectedly escape their toils, at the moment when its capture was sure, glare upon each other a more mortifying disappointment than that indicated by my pursuers at the instant on hearing that I was out of their bailiwick and consequently out of their jurisdiction. So he escaped. At the close of the debate with Walker, remember, Campbell extended this invitation to anyone who was qualified to debate on infant baptism or the subject of baptism. A man by the name of W.L. McCullough, another Presbyterian, a preacher of Augusta, Kentucky, accepted the challenge, and arrangements were made. The debate was going to be held in Washington, Kentucky, October of 1823. Now, several days before the debate, Campbell set out on horseback to make the 300-mile trip. Guess who accompanies him? Sidney Rigdon, to take notes about the debate. He got to talk to him for 300 miles, and he still left the truth and went to Mormonism. When Campbell met McCullough, October the 14th, he was disappointed. He said he was an obstinate, difficult man to talk to, and he couldn't develop a friendly relationship with him. The rules of the debate were set by McCullough. Campbell chose for his moderator a man who was the most popular Baptist preacher in Kentucky, a man by the name of Jeremiah Vardaman. Vardaman would later leave the Baptist church, became a powerful preacher in the Restoration movement, and in his older years, he returned to the Baptist church. But Vardaman related an incident that took place as he was traveling to the debate. He came across a man who he said, I assumed he was a Baptist. He thought he'd have a little fun with him. So he made him think that he, Vardaman, was a Presbyterian. He says, do you think that your man can beat my man? You think that our man is likely to whip Campbell? And the man says, is he the same Campbell that preached at Mount Pleasant, Ohio, on the subject of baptism with a Mr. Walker? Vardaman knew, but he says, yeah, I think he may have been. Well, he says, I've heard that debate, I saw it, and all I have to say is that all of creation couldn't whip Mr. Campbell in a debate. Campbell and McCullough went over the same ground that he and Walker had gone over, except something very different now comes up in this debate. And this is a very important time. 1823, you can mark it on the back of your eyelids. It's an important time to remember. In addition to the other things that they talked about with Walker, when he came to the subject of the purpose, he said the purpose of baptism is for the remission of sin. And children, infants, have no sin. Therefore, there is no need to baptize them. Now, this was a revolutionary thought for the people of that day. And the Baptists were against it, obviously, because they did not preach that baptism was for the remission of sins. It was merely necessary to get into the Baptist church. But Campbell said to them, he said, my Baptist brethren, as well as the Pedo-Baptist brotherhood, I humbly concede, require to be admonished on this point. You have been, some of you, no doubt, too different in asserting this grand import of baptism. Now, Campbell really showed me what he was made of. This is the fourth night of the debate, and he is at the home of his host, and all the great Baptist preachers of Kentucky are there, and they are gloating over their man, Thomas or Alexander Campbell, who is the great defender of baptism by immersion and against infant baptism by sprinkling. And they have embraced him. And what is he going to do? Is he going to say, well, I've developed some good friends here. I certainly don't want to lose their friendship by letting them know what I really think and teach. Well, in that meeting, he said already, baptism is for the remission of sins. Now they're beginning to scratch their heads. What have we got here? But here's what he said. He said, having secured the special favor and attention of the Baptist ministry and of the uncommitted public, while I had in one room at the residence of my kind host, Major Davis of Washington, all the principal Baptist preachers of the state, I thought it expedient to introduce myself more fully to their acquaintance. This I did in the following manner. Now you can just see them looking at him. He says, brethren, I fear that if you knew me better, you would esteem me and love me less. For let me tell you, in all candor, I have almost as much against you Baptists as I have against the Presbyterians. You can see their mouths drop down now. They err in one thing and you in another, and probably you are each equidistant from the original apostolic Christianity. I paused, he said, and such a silence ensued, accompanied with a piercing look from all sides of the room I seldom before witnessed. He has thrown himself into the lion's den, and he taunts the lions. Campbell took that opportunity after they challenged him to pass out 10 copies of the Christian Baptist that he happened to have with him, with the article on the kingdom of the clergy, in which he attacks the hypocrisy of denominational preachers of the day of which they were a part. Gutsy, gutsy man. Campbell's association with the Baptist has been the subject of many discussions. Why did he stay with them so long? Perhaps because he used it in order to teach all the more people. But he said this. He said, so long as they will hear reproof, suffer exhortation, allow us to declare our sentiments without restraint, so long as they maintain a willingness to know the whole truth and any disposition to obey it, so long as they will hear us and cordially have fellowship with us, we will have fellowship with them. We will thus labor for their good and endeavor to correct what appears to be amiss. He didn't say they were wrong. He says, we'll stay as long as they will let us teach. Apparently, the Redstone Baptist Association knew that there was no point in letting this thing go any further. And so in 1824, they excluded the Brush Run Church from the Redstone Association. At the conclusion of the McCalla debate, the debate was put into printed form so that thousands of people who could not attend the debate could read and be instructed by that good book. That had a lot to do with Barton Stone coming to a full knowledge of baptism for the remission of sins. He had previously come to that conclusion on his own, but he said he had let it drop for a while. And then when he read the debate, he resumed his teaching on the subject of baptism for the remission of sins. In September of the same year that he had that debate with McCalla, he went down into Kentucky for a 3-month trip. And that's when he met Barton Stone, and that's when he met another Baptist preacher by the name of Raccoon John Smith, which we're going to get to next week. It was on this trip that Campbell and Stone came together for the first time. They would meet again later on. Campbell had great respect for the Bible, but he had a problem with the King James Version, that some of the words had changed in meaning and needed correction. And so he felt it was a good idea for him to come out with a revised version of the New Testament, which he did in 1826. Now, he didn't do the translating himself. He used the Gospels from a man named George Campbell of Aberdeen, Scotland. Acts and Revelation is translated by Philip Doddridge of London, England. The epistles were translated by James McKnight. And Campbell wrote a 100-page preface to these. He made some changes in some of the things that were translated. So he came out with this living oracles, is what he called the New Testament. But his argument was that a language is continually changing, like customs and fashions and apparel. And sometimes they change so that the word doesn't have the same meaning. It may even mean exactly the opposite. So he felt it was good and necessary to come out with this living oracles, and it went through several editions. It was accepted by some, rejected by others. 2 or 3 occasions, the Baptists had a good time publicly burning the living oracles. But what he did in that book, in that translation, was to translate it into English, not a paraphrase, but to translate it to the best of the man's ability to translate directly into English. And he changed such pronouns as thy and thine and thou to you, except in prayer language. In translating it exactly, he changed words like baptize to immerse. That's what baptize meant. It was transliterated from the Greek baptizo. Should never have been translated baptized. It should have always been translated as immerse, and that's what this version did. And John the Baptist was John the Immerser. And can you just get a little idea of why the Baptists didn't really like that version? There was no word Baptist in all of the book. It was immerse and immerser. Well, it was 550 pages in one volume when it finally came out. Many rejected it in the Baptist group as a Campbellite Bible, but it certainly wasn't. Well, we started 10 minutes late, but I'm not going to go 10 minutes past time. Next week, I want to get into Raccoon John Smith, and I only have probably about 30 pages of notes yet to go on Alexander Campbell, but I'm not going to give them to you. I'm going to try to get on with Raccoon John Smith, Walter Scott, and then we'll try real hard to complete this thing by the last Wednesday of this month. I said last week we'd spill over into, what was it, July? Or I didn't really mean that. I probably scared some people off. I meant April, but I think we'll finish in March. And I'll just try to pick some high points. I've got to tell you a couple of other things about Alexander Campbell, and I'll do that next week. He had 5 major debates, and we've only talked about a couple. He debated with a Catholic priest named Purcell, and I'll tell you what, you talk about a gutsy guy. His proposition was so good that I may read that to you. And we'll try to cover some high points. I'd like to mention his trip into Great Britain. He winds up in jail for 10 days. So there's some good things that happened to Campbell, but some very tragic things. While he was in jail in Scotland, actually, was when his 11-year-old son was drowned. Thank you for your attention, and we'll be at it again hard and fast next week.